What's going on, everyone? You're tuned in to the Founder Hour podcast. I'm your co-host, Pat, and today on the show, we're joined by Mark Gainey. Mark is the co-founder and executive chairman of Strava, an app for mostly runners and cyclists to track their physical activity and engage with others on its social network. We spoke about Mark's upbringing and early career, all the way up to what inspired him to start the company and his vision for the future of the space. Please enjoy our conversation with Mark Gainey. Mark, appreciate you being here. You know, we can just sort of dive right in. Excited to chat about all things, your life, your personal upbringing, and how you sort of ended up starting Strava and how the experience has been, and maybe some of the key takeaways that you can share with people listening, and then also your thoughts on the future of the space and where it's going, because I'm sure there's a lot of exciting things still to come. So. Why don't we kick things off? I think I saw that you were born in Denver, Colorado, but raised in Reno, Nevada. So tell us what life was like in Reno. What were you into? What kind of kid were you? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. Well, most people think of Reno as you either go to gamble or get divorced. So, I had to overcome a lot of sort of misperceptions. But as a kid growing up there, frankly, it was fantastic. I mean, we're at 5,000 feet. We got the Sierra Nevadas. We got Lake Tahoe half an hour away. You've got the mountains. I remember as a kid, starting in first grade, they would close the school every Wednesday at noon to bus us up to the local ski resort, to teach us how to ski. That was basically PE back in the 70s. So, my upbringing was living outdoors, riding bikes, BMX in the dirt with my friends. Just, lots of soccer. That was kind of my sport as a kid growing up. And then as high school approached, it turned out I was a pretty good runner. And so, and I was really fortunate, guys, to be on this fantastic team. I was at Reno High School, and we were just very fortunate to have this group of guys that came together at that time and won a bunch of state championships, and, my love for the sport. But yeah, Reno was just one of those special places that, I mean, even summer jobs. My summer jobs were in Lake Tahoe, basically pumping gas at a local marina and enjoying the water.
Were you would you say you were like a product of your environment a little bit, or did it kind of run in the family to be like an athlete and just kind of be into sports and all that?
I think it was the product of the environment. I mean, my parents were super supportive and just always kept us active, but no one else in my family likes to run the way I do. Actually, my younger brother, I have a younger brother and a younger sister, and they're both active in their own rights, and we all did the same sports and things. My dad was a physician, so he was always, busy at the hospital, and my mom was stay at home and had the hard job and taking care of the three of us. But no, I think you're right, Pat. It was very much sort of just product of environment and that time, right? I got to admit, the generation. I'm 53 years old, so that was a time where you could go out and be gone for hours, and no one really cared.
Mark, how did running make you feel?
That's a great one, Pasha. The thing that I really came to appreciate about running were a couple of things. One was just the simple fact that it's just you against yourself. Like, even when I was on the team and so forth, it's very much sort of just pursuing what's possible for you. And to be on a team and so forth, those are added dimensions. But for me, I think there was just always testing of limits. That running has this funny way of doing it. We often refer at Strava to type 2 fun, right? Type 1 fun is you're having fun in the moment. It's great. You're enjoying yourself. Type 2 fun is often in the moment. It's not very fun. Like it hurts. It's kind of painful, but then you finish, and that sense of sort of satisfaction and elation and accomplishment, running did that for me over and over. I also have, my parents will tell you, I had these funny memories of, I think it was like 6th grade, and I learned about cross country, and I can't explain to you why, but I just thought it was really cool to be able to go out and run over logs and across trails and just kind of do stupid stuff like that. And it's been with me ever since. So yeah. And today it's meditative. Honestly, like if I don't get 30 minutes in doing something active, forget my physical well-being. It's a mental state that is really what keeps me going.
Yeah, I took a peek at your Strava profile. We'll talk about that in a bit, because I noticed you definitely run a lot. But yeah, so I guess talking about being as a kid, like being into sports and all this, did you think you would be like a professional athlete when you grew up, or did you have other aspirations as well?
No, it wasn't about being professional, but it was about. I think my parents were really good at and something I even tell my I've got twin boys now, and it's like, look, don't really care what you pursue, but whatever it's going to be, try and do it well. And so I think whatever I was doing, whether it was, I mean, academically, I was a good student. I wasn't always the best student, but I tried. With the sports, I wanted to see how far I could push, and it probably was. I go back to coaches who were incredibly supportive and sort of just having that ecosystem around you and being able to push. So it wasn't about professional endeavors. I wish I could tell you that my parents will say that there was some entrepreneurial blood that was flowing in there from pretty early on. I was always kind of thinking about businesses, but it really wasn't until I got to college that I then started to think about what makes me tick from a professional side. And that's where, ironically, the two did come together, sports and entrepreneurship.
And Mark, you must have been smart enough to get into Harvard, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's not a bad school. It's not like the best.
It's not USC, is it?
Yeah, it's not USC.
Yeah.
It's not USC, but it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Did you want to pursue sports there? I mean, why did you choose Harvard? I assume if you got into Harvard, you got into other schools as well. Why Harvard?
Yeah, funny story. So honestly, kid from Reno, Nevada, Harvard wasn't on the radar at all. My dad had gone to Cornell back east, and so I was familiar with some of the Ivy League schools and was looking at that. In fact, I was thinking about the hotel school at the time at Cornell, and I was being recruited. Again, just being on this team was pretty special. And then I was fortunate enough my senior year in high school to win the individual state championship. So I kind of had that in my back pocket and was garnering some interest. And it was because of that the Harvard coaches reached out to me. Again, this is 1985, 1986, and they sent me a nice letter just saying, hey, we've seen your SAT scores and your accomplishments in running. Would you ever consider at Harvard? And I remember my father at the time was like, look, whether you decide to apply or not, you're going to do him the courtesy of writing back and thanking them for that note and, fill out the application. And I really, at the time, like, again, kid from Reno, like, why would I go to Harvard? That's a bunch of really smart, geeky people, and I'm not going to fit in. But I did fill out the application, and they continued to recruit, and I had the opportunity to visit in the spring. And honestly, Posh, at the end of the day, the way I made the decision was, well, I don't know if I'm going to fit in here or not, but it's probably a lot easier to transfer from Harvard to somewhere else than it is to transfer up to there. Yep. So I kind of figured, like, let me give it a shot.
Yeah.
And see what would happen.
So strategic. Harvard. I mean, it's nice to have like a position of leverage with Harvard, right? Where you're like, look, I don't have to come. I know you want me, but I don't need to go there. I can do whatever I need to do anywhere else.
I don't know if I thought about it as leverage, but I definitely was like option value. Okay, right. where do I have the greatest option value? And I think, well, they were kind enough to give me a shot. Let me go see what this might be like. The great irony was I didn't run when I got there. I was injured, and then that led to an opportunity to join the crew program. Mm-hmm. So to this day, I've always felt indebted to the track and field and cross country coaches at Harvard because they gave me the chance, and then I didn't actually fulfill my obligation. I shifted over to a different sport, but yeah, fond memories.
Was it a bad injury? Like, I mean, was it something that really set you back, like in other areas, or was it just you decided maybe I should do something else?
It was a little bit of both. What happened was I showed up my freshman year with stress fracture in my lower leg, which kept me from competing that fall. And then there was a little bit of, boy, I've been running a long time, and I was struggling a little bit with, like, how do I get my motivation back? Great team, really good group of men and women on that team and so forth. And it was just this crazy situation where, again, back in the mid 80s, the crew coaches were pretty smart. They would go around recruiting from other teams and literally like roaming the dining halls looking for, in my case, a tall, skinny guy with a big set of lungs. And a very long story short, I was introduced to the head of the lightweight program there, and he put me in a boat. I went out and I was hooked. And so in some ways I was able to take a lot of those things that drove me to enjoy running, but now apply it to just a slightly different sport in a different team dynamic and learning a whole new set of skills. I could pull pretty good, but I was not a rower growing up in Reno, Nevada. So that was just the easy transition. And frankly, the Ivy League is unique in that, these aren't athletic scholarships. They have financial aid, but they were very supportive of me switching over. It wasn't like there was some drawn out negotiation. They just were happy to see me, happy and pursuing other athletic endeavors.
I'm curious, and I'm sure it's a little bit out of order here, but what did those track and field cross country coaches say when they eventually? I assume they eventually knew that you started Strava. Was there ever any sort of communication there, or between you and them, or them and you?
Well, it's funny. I haven't seen Frank Haggerty was a coach at the time. I haven't talked to the track and cross country folks, but there was the gentleman, one of the two gentlemen who actually hosted me when I was out there just checking out the program as a senior in high school and was able to stay in their room. So one of the top runners, his name is Paul Gompers. He's now a professor at Harvard Business School and teaches entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial finance. And he now teaches the Strava case study. And so, a couple times a year, he and I will connect and I'll guest there and do that. And that's really fun because we go back to some fond memories. But ironically, Posh, the connection that I have now, and there's a lot of connection to it, the Harvard Crew program and Strava, those ties are inextricable. I mean, it's deep. And Charlie Butt, was my coach at the time and is now the head of the whole program. We probably connect at least a couple times every year. It's great.
That's awesome.
I mean, deep
That's
roots.
awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah. You mentioned like at the time when you got to college, you started having more of these like entrepreneurial sort of things, in your head, and you like wanted to grab thoughts, I guess, the bug. And I guess how did that come about? Like, what did you sort of envision that you would do maybe once you graduated college, and, like just give us kind of that rundown there.
Yeah. So two quick stories to give you sort of a sense of how sort of rambling I was. So my first entrepreneurial opportunity was my junior year. I actually was injured again. So you'll see a common thread, which is that I tend to play hard, get injured, and then so I was injured my junior year. I had a back injury that kept me out of the program for a bit, and I had a good friend, a guy named Chris Moore, and he and I figured out that we could probably get some pretty good spending money if we created a concessions business for all the non-mainstream sports. So, imagine you go to a football game or the basketball game, there's professional concessions that have all the popcorn and pizza and so forth. But for indoor track or, women's volleyball or, swimming, there was nobody offering, Cokes and hot dogs. So he and I would literally go to the local grocery store. We'd pile in the trunk of his car, all these hot dog buns and so forth, and 6 packs of Coke. And we'd show up and sell this stuff. And turned out, the margin was great. You can get a hot dog and a bun for 9 cents and turn around and sell for $2 to your fellow students, and great spending money. So that to me was like the first example of, I love this. Like we're kind of creating it and figuring out the finances. And, it was short lived because once I went back and started competing again, then my time was precious. But that little kernel was an opportunity. Now, when it came time to graduating, totally different story. I didn't apply for jobs my senior year. I was focused on trying to make the national team as a rower. That's where I was going. And in a cruel twist of fate, I went home for about a week after graduation, just to vacation before I would start my training. And I blew out my lower back. And so that kind of was this dark period that sort of forced me into a whole reevaluation of, okay, wow, what am I going to do now that I've graduated and maybe rowing isn't in my future? But
yeah,
it took me a while to get back to the entrepreneurial part.
I want to talk about this in a second, but before we do, kind of going back to the entrepreneurial part, obviously experience is something, but oftentimes you hear people who are interested in entrepreneurship might be inspired by somebody, whether it's like a family member, whether it's somebody in history that started a business and was successful. Like, was there anyone for you when you were in college that you sort of looked up to as an entrepreneur that you're like, I want to do that. I want to be what he is or she is?
Yeah. I mean, we had good family friends that owned businesses in Reno at the time, literally like a construction business and so forth that were close and that frankly were good mentors to me. There's a guy named Dave Clark who to this day remains a good friend that I admired for what they had done, kind of built something from scratch and so forth. And as I mentioned, my dad was a physician, so it was different, but he was actually an electrical engineer before. That's what he did his undergrad in. And my dad had literally gone and in his free time had designed and built and distributed a ski product. And so I would say early, those were maybe some of the mentor people that I admired, heroes were pretty close to home. You have to move forward a few years, Pat. And once I started my first job out of school, which was frankly a job where I got to call entrepreneurs all day long. That was literally my job, was to get on the phone, and we used to call it dialing for deals. I was looking for investment opportunities for a private equity firm. And that's where I really started to connect with entrepreneurs and start to find my heroes, the people that I admired and wanted to try to emulate.
Mm-hmm. And so that was your first job. How did you even come across private equity? Like, it sounded like in college you weren't even focused on anything but being a rower and going, to the national team. And then, a lot of people I feel like have this strong focus of trying to get into private equity after college and just somehow don't end up there. But you didn't. So I'm curious how that happened.
Yeah, no. So lots of twists and turns. The very short version is blow out my back. I'm now sitting at home in Reno. I've got two parents who are like, hey, this is great. We paid for your education. You need to find a job. There were resumes that went out across the country over this 6 to 9 month period. This is now 1990, 1991. Not the best economic environment at the time. A lot of my peers had actually lost their jobs, and I had them out everywhere. And it was a classic situation where it took about 6-7 months. I started my job at the firm called TA Associates in the spring of 91. And it was one of these crazy things where I was in the Bay Area interviewing with another company, where I failed miserably. Like, the interview was a disaster. It was with an economic consulting firm, had no business applying for that job. Sitting in a hotel room, kind of licking my wounds. I get a call from my mother. She says, some company just called and said, they're in the Bay Area. They've got an office there. Would you be willing to come in and spend an hour with them? Who is it? It's a firm called TA Associates. I don't really know what they do, but kind of 2 degrees of separation. And I got lucky. I interviewed with somebody who really loved to hire athletes. They just found that hiring athletes to do the job, which was to basically get on the phone and be willing to make cold calls, was a pretty good match. And
why do you think that is? Because I've noticed that too. And, former athletes that do really well in like a sales environment or something that is related to people and dealing with people. Like, why? I mean, besides the obvious fact of like, being a team player and all that kind of stuff, is there anything else that you think makes an athlete so good at that?
Well, I can speak for endurance athletes, but actually I think it's true across anything. It goes back to that type 2 fun I talked about, which is that we seem to enjoy suffering. I think athletes are just generally pretty good at sort of recognizing that if you want really good things, you gotta work, and
Right.
the work is often not that glamorous, not that fun, but the payoff on the other side is pretty special.
I want to just take what you just said, Mark, and kind of hone in on it, because I feel like what you just said is true, but also, and this has really nothing to do with maybe being a founder or this podcast, but I think it's interesting, is that the athletes of today, at least those in the mainstream in certain sports, it doesn't feel like they necessarily have that mentality of, we like the struggle, and it's become more about the end result as opposed to the process, right? Like, and even at my workplace, a lot of the guys and gals are ex-athletes, and it's a nice place to be because everybody understands that, you win some, you lose some, but you got to focus on the process, not the results, right? What changed, right? Like, I mean, in the last, I guess, 10 to 20 years, where you have athletes that are more focused on, results perhaps, and the fame and the attention than the process, right? And of course, I'm generalizing here.
Yeah, I think we are. I think that we're probably just brainstorming a bit together. My quick reaction is that the sheer volume of media and the social media aspects and the way in which somebody can be successful without actually not having reached perhaps the echelon of their sport, but because they're good in a 6-second soundbite, or they're I mean, that's at least one. There's probably many factors associated with it, but that's the one that I point to. I look at it, I'm raising 2 boys who are now 20 years old, and I can see sort of the impact that a lot of these elements have had on their life. And I feel for the athletes. It's a little bit of like, what defines success? Is it number of views and hits on Instagram, or is it actually going out and pursuing your life's dream of whatever it might be, accomplishing climbing Everest or
Sure.
attempting to win gold in Beijing? I think it's a hard one because I think they're trying to balance a lot of those.
For sure, and I agree. And the deeper reason why I asked is because I know that there's folks that listen to our podcast that were athletes, are athletes, or are parents of athletes. I mean, we have a wide range of listeners, so they might fit into any of those categories. And I almost worry that some of the athletes these days have a different mindset and aren't necessarily focused on, well, what happens if, God forbid, I do get injured, or I don't get drafted, or I do get drafted and then I get injured, or then I do get drafted, I play, but I'm not as good, or I don't cut it out, or the team doesn't like me, and then what's next, right? What, in your opinion, as a, I don't want to call you a former athlete because you're still an athlete, but as an athlete, what is your advice to those that, are currently, in competitive sports about their future beyond sports or future beyond whatever athletic program they're in?
Yeah. I guess what I would say, the thing that I've appreciated is that if you've decided that being active and being athletic is part of your DNA, is part of your life, then it is a lifelong journey of which there will be many, many chapters. And I think about my own ride has been from, many would argue that I eclipsed my senior year in high school. I mean, I won a state championship, and from there on, it was downhill. I was fortunate enough to make the Harvard crew team, but there were many rowers there that were much better than I was. I could pull hard. I was in what they call the engine room in the boat. Don't put me in a place where I had to balance the boat or lead it in any stretch. So, and since that time, I've gone and competed whatever in marathons and Ironmans, but I'm not winning these competitions. I'm simply enjoying the picking a challenge and how close can I come to accomplishing it? And as I mentioned to you, I was 10 days away from doing an Ironman event, and I had a bicycle accident. It cost me 13 surgeries to come back. I was like, over a course of a number of years. So I think my advice is it's maintaining perspective. Why are you deciding to be athletic, or why are you deciding to be active? And for me, it's a lifelong passion. It's a journey of which, and this is why Strava is so important. Michael and I, when we founded Strava, it was very much around, if it just solves a problem for he and I, if we're the only two customers, it's a win. And the problem we were trying to solve was, it's really hard to stay motivated when life gets in the way. Like, we love being active, we love competing, we love having that feeling of being fit, but man, it's tough to do when you're trying to build the rest of your life, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally, whether it's raising family and having a partner in life. And so, sorry, a very long answer.
Oh, no, that's what I was looking. That's what I was looking for.
It's that journey, and I think once you appreciate it, then you can maintain the perspective, and that's where I feel really lucky.
You mentioned Michael, who's your co-founder in Strava, Michael Horvath, I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Tell us, how you guys met, and kind of the early kind of days of. I think you guys started another company together, right, before Strava. Tell us about that. Well, I guess before you do, how did the Dial In for Dollars go? I mean, did you do well? Was it was it something that you liked or not really?
It was something that I grew into, like anything else. Type 2 fun. It was. I think if you talk to the partners I work for, great guys, still my mentors to this day. Really enjoyed working for. I worked for 3 partners in Palo Alto, and it was hard. Early on, I was trying to call tech companies that I wasn't familiar with. I graduated with a degree in fine arts. I basically studied art history, so I had no business calling on Unix developers and kind of networking companies. But I learned how to talk the lingo, and over time they gave me more and more freedom. The partners allowed me to call. And by the time I was finishing, I spent 4.5 years there. So I probably overstayed my welcome. Typically, it's like 2 years, and then you go on to business school. But I stuck around for just over 4 years. And, I was calling, you mentioned earlier, like, who was a hero. I had the opportunity to get Jim Gennard on the phone, and he was the founder of Oakley Sunglass Company. And what an amazing guy and an amazing story. If you ever get a chance, you got to get him on his podcast. I'm like, my story is
I'm writing his name
boring.
down right now. Yeah.
He amazing. And so that's what became fun for me, was that I had the opportunity to just get on and collect these stories from these individuals. And it definitely lit a fire. By 1995, I was like, maybe I'm just going to go launch a pizza shop, or, something really simple, but I've got to go do this. I've got an itch that I have to scratch.
So how did you meet your co-founder?
Ironically, the crew team. So he was 2 years ahead of me. He was class of 88. I was class of 90. And when I joined, that class in particular really took me under their wing. Michael and a handful of his friends were kind enough to kind of invite me in and show me the ropes. And Michael, even after he graduated, stayed very close to the program, was actually doing some coaching. And so he and I we became close friends then. And he went off and got his PhD in economics. And ironically ended up in California teaching at Stanford. And that's when he and I kind of really reconnected, because now both of us were here in the Bay Area.
Okay, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but why did you end up leaving TA Associates? Like, were you like over the job, or did you want to do something else? And then,
It really was that entrepreneurial bug, and you have to think back. 1995 was an interesting time, in that this was really the birth of the commercial internet, right? And it was just starting. So there was a part of that where I'm like, there's something going on here. There was a little bit of, as I mentioned to you, like, I kind of overstayed my welcome to begin with. Typically someone stays for, maybe 2-3 years, and then they go back to business school. And I wasn't a student. I was living with a bunch of business school students. So I used to joke, it's like, I'll take advantage of their education, but I'm not going to go back and try to do graduate school. And so it was just one of those moments where I needed to figure out what was next. And again, having talked to all these entrepreneurs, I just felt like I will regret, a little bit like we talked about earlier, I was going to regret not trying Harvard. Maybe it's not going to work, but let me try it and have the option value. It was the same thing around entrepreneurship. I felt like, okay, I've got 4 years at TA Associates. I've got no debt. I'm recently married, but we don't have a mortgage to pay. Like, the risk is really low to go try to start something. I don't know what that thing is, but now is the window. And worst case scenario, I remember telling Lisa, who was my wife at the time, it's like, okay, worst case, give me a year and a half. At least I'll have a great application for business school. Like, if that's the worst thing that happens, I'll be able to go back. And so that was the thesis back then.
Yeah.
And again, I got lucky.
So what did you end up doing? Or I guess, Posh, did you have another question?
Yeah. So I know you had mentioned that Horvath was now at Stanford teaching economics, if I'm not mistaken. How did you guys reconnect, or were you guys already keeping in touch at the time and he just happened to be out there?
Yeah, no, we were definitely friends the whole time. We'd run marathons together in the early 90s and things when he was studying in Chicago. That's where he got his PhD. So we were always close. And then you fast forward to that 95 time frame where I've now left TA Associates and I'm trying to start something. It was pretty funny. So I'll tell you, so here's what I did. I left the firm. First thing I had to do was figure out how to make ends meet. Like, even though I worked for a venture capital firm, I was not a venture capitalist. Like, I did not have millions of dollars sitting in my bank account. So I negotiated with my landlord. I started cleaning his pool in exchange for a discount on my rent. And then I went down to a local running store, a little place called Metro Sport, and I got a job getting $8 an hour to sell running shoes. But my theory was, number one, like, that's a good kind of job to just punch the clock for a few hours and then go work on my startup and no one will feel bad about it. And then I started trying to recruit friends, because entrepreneurship is lonely. And I was really hoping I could find a co-founder. And there were 2 or 3 folks that I talked pretty hard to. And one of them was Michael. He was uniquely positioned. He was a professor at Stanford. He had a high-speed internet connection in his office, that was like gold.
Huge.
In 95.
Very big value add, yeah.
A very big value add. And he was willing to sit and listen to a lot of my dumb ideas. And we just we hit it off. And I think, he tells the story better than I do, but over time, he just realized this could be fun. In his case, he sort of moonlighted as an entrepreneur. He stayed in academia through that first business. But
one thing that just stood out to me from what you just said is kind of this thing about ego, right? That I feel like someone who's 4 or 5 years into their career working in like finance, private equity, and then being able to leave and like go clean pools and work at the local shop for like $8 an hour. I mean, that's something that I feel like a lot of people wouldn't be able to do because of the ego or because of just being used to certain lifestyle or what have you. I mean, is that something that you've thought about at all, or is that something that you're intentional about at all? Like, what? I
Yeah.
mean, do you have any thoughts to share about that? Because I feel like it's probably not as common as one might
Yeah.
think.
Actually, I'm really glad you brought it up because it's an area that I spend a lot of time talking to entrepreneurs about. And there's two things I always bring back that I have fond memories of that. One is you're right. You got to check your ego at the door. I mean, here I was with a Harvard degree and I'd been working in venture capital and so forth. And I made a choice. Like I really felt like I needed to see what this startup thing was all about and could I do it? And so because of that, the choice was actually fairly easy. Like I had to figure out how to pay the monthly rent and put food on the table. And, Lisa was super supportive and willing to help me in that. She was a preschool teacher at the time. And so
Were you guys married at the time?
we've been married 6 months. The good news was her dad had been an entrepreneur. Unfortunately, he'd passed away before I met him, but he'd been an entrepreneur himself. So I think she sort of understood what she was getting into at some level. And so I two things. One is I found it actually pretty easy. Like just check the ego. It's because I was pursuing what I wanted to go do, which was to get something off the ground. The other thing that I learned in hindsight, to this day, one of my best friends was my manager from Metro Sport, from the running store. His name's Tomas. He now sells real estate in Portland, Oregon. The greatest guy. And what happened was I joined this little running store and start selling shoes, and you start to meet these other people who are there, and they all have really interesting stories. They're all sort of in the midst of transition and thinking about what's next in life. And we ended up developing these incredible friendships that have now lasted 30 years. So you're exactly right. Like this idea that somehow there's a template for you're supposed to take this step to success. It's a false premise.
Yeah, and as an entrepreneur and even as a founder, CEO, whatever, it is very difficult to check your ego at the door, especially when you reach a level of success. I think maybe early on when you kind of get humbled and you're struggling, and I think being an athlete probably helps with that because of what you said earlier about, you enjoy the struggle, right? That type 2 fun that you keep bringing up. That makes a lot of sense. I think, and I'm curious how you've handled it, and maybe we could touch upon it now or later, but we'll touch upon it now since we're talking about it. How has that changed for you, being an entrepreneur now for so long, being a leader? Like, have you struggled with that at times where you're like, I got to check my ego at the door? Or how do you do it? And what's your advice to those that are in positions of authority and leadership that, maybe forget that the ego is talking sometimes and not just, them?
Yeah. So again, here's where I was blessed early on, and it's just stuck with me forever. So one of the advantages, I didn't realize it until later, but one of the advantages of going and starting my first company when I was 25, 26 and had no business starting a company, because I had, again, zero operating experience, no management experience, had never sold or marketed anything. But what that did, because that was my background or lack of background, I immediately said, well, I got to go find amazing people who know how to do this stuff.
Right.
And so I very quickly learned humility, which is that I don't know how to. You don't want me touching software. I can't write code to save my life, even though I've founded 2 software companies. When my sales team, so the original company we built was an enterprise software company. I'll never forget. A gentleman named Paul was our VP of sales there, and he used to joke, we got to get Mark in the room for the first 30 seconds because he's got the vision and will help the potential customer understand, but we got to get him out before he gives the software away for free. Like, I couldn't sell, I couldn't market, I couldn't write the code, but I knew that, like I recognized that. And so my job was, how do I just bring an amazing team together to go do this? And that's carried forward now, again, for 25, 30 years, which is I'll bring the enthusiasm. I've got the ideas. I got a good sense of vision where we want to go, but it doesn't happen without an amazing team, period. End of discussion. And so it's my job to see if I can just find those teammates and bring them together. And it morphs over time as any good team. We're just about to watch. I think you guys are down in LA, right? I mean, we're just about to watch, the LA Rams, and they've put together a pretty special team right now. Unfortunately, as a 49er fan, I'm not happy about it, but that's what you do. And that, I think, has been able to keep my ego in check. I just recognized from day one, it doesn't happen without a lot of people. Yep. And that's it's one of the best parts about entrepreneurship.
And, that's very admirable. And I think that, I was joking about it with somebody yesterday that, a lot of these like leadership coaches like have never been leaders. And I almost wish that, leaders would be leadership coaches. But then this individual said that, well, leaders are too busy leading. So, they can't be leadership coaches. But that's why we have podcasts like this so that people can hear and learn from folks like you. There was something that you touched upon earlier, which was, looking for a co-founder. And I think that that's something that is an interesting topic for a lot of folks who have ideas or want to be entrepreneurs, but realize that perhaps, they don't have a skill set, or they don't have a specific skill set, or that they just don't want to do it alone because it is mentally taxing. I know that, your eventual co-founder was a good friend of yours, but did you talk to other people, and what was that process like for you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I won't disclose their names now since they turned me down, and they're still good friends. But there were a number of folks that were here in the Bay Area that I was showing them my business plan, and it was with the thesis that you want to do this with me, right? You want to go do it, and totally understood at the end of the day why it was not going to be the right thing for them. But I was of the mindset of, frankly, the two things you just said. One is it's lonely. I'd love to have somebody I could do this with. And two, I kind of recognize that there's certain things about the way that I see the world where if I could balance it, and Michael was a perfect, I think the reason we've been such tremendous business partners now for 30 years is that we are wired differently. We're compatible in many ways. We're both competitive. We both, we're, hopefully you get a chance to meet him at some point. I'm sorry he's not even here tonight, but it's you just see that there's a lot of similarities between the two of us, but then there's some fundamental differences. And just the simple, by telling you he is a PhD in economics, that almost says everything. Like, yep. Michael is my data god. He is the person who understands the numbers in ways that forget it, I would never do. The way he approaches problems, he loves to go solve the problems himself. And really dig in and really understand the data. I tend to immediately say, I'm going to go find somebody who's an expert in this, and let me go figure out where the experts are and have them help me understand it. So that's ultimately, again, got lucky because I don't think I recognized it back in 1995, but that's why we've been together so long.
Yeah. So you said it was an enterprise software company. What exactly were you guys doing, and how did that all sort of go? Like, what was the end result?
So here's the great irony. Here I am, the founder of Strava. 1995 was when we wrote the business plan for Strava. It was not called Strava at the time. It was called Kana Sports. Kana was the name of my dog. Why did we name it after the dog? Because Jim Gennard from Oakley named his company after his dog. So I'm like, okay, well, that's good karma. So I'll do that. And we were trying to build a virtual locker room for a bunch of athletes to come together to keep us motivated, circa 1995. That was the business plan that I started going out and pitching and talking to companies. And the very short version was, great idea, wrong time. But what it did was, by having conversations with people, it introduced us to another problem. We started talking to a lot of the sporting goods companies because we were hoping that they would actually become our partners and sponsors and advertisers on this virtual locker room. And what they were telling us was, we've just invested $1 million in this website, and we're struggling because we're getting all these customer emails from consumers. But our business is predicated on selling to the retailers. In fact, as a manufacturer of running shoes or skis or bicycles, our customer is the retailer, not the end consumer. Yet on the internet, there's this whole problem because the consumer is coming directly to, again, trekbikes.com or k2skis.com. And so we were hearing that going, that's crazy. Why would you spend $1 million and not want to talk to your customer? That seems insane. And we sort of figured to ourselves at the time, well, maybe if we can solve that problem, they'll get excited about our virtual locker room. So we started kind of parallel processing, sort of exploring how do we solve customer email and assume somebody else had done it in another industry and we could just bring it to sports. And it turned out nobody had. It turned out that this was a problem that was universal. Whether you were at the time, whether you were Yahoo or eBay or Chase Manhattan Bank or Ford Motor Company, it didn't matter. If you were beginning to build your business online, you were suffering with high volumes of customer email and no real systems to handle it. And so, a very long story short, we pivoted. We evolved. We put Kana Sports on the back burner because we realized that there were a bunch of reasons why that probably won't work. But this customer email thing has some legs, and we found some folks to help us code some software to help us think through that. And amazing experience. Between 1996 and 2000, we took it from 2 guys and a dog to 1,200 employees. We took it public in 99. I think our market cap at its peak was like 11 billion. It's a good business. I mean, we were generating hundreds of millions in revenue. Kind of had every .com on the planet using our software to manage their customer communications, and learned a lot. It was really trial by fire. Some unfinished business. We were also there in 2000, 2001 when the nuclear winter hit that first .com bust. But great. That's what pretty much got me hooked. I will be an entrepreneur forever after that.
Because of that. That's incredible. Wow. And so, I mean, what ended up ultimately happening? Did you just, want to do something different? Did you, feel like you overstayed your welcome again in your own company, or what happened that, obviously you ended up, launching Strava. So you had this idea in the back of your head that you always were passionate about, clearly. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so we got to a point in mid 1999. There were a bunch of things going on with the company. There were acquisition offers, and we realized that it probably was an opportune time to take the company public. And so we hired a CEO. I recruited a CEO to come in and run the business. I became president and chairman in title, but really we had a new CEO running everything. And I stuck around for another year. Learned a lot from this CEO. I mean, we took the company public together, and then we made 4 acquisitions. I think at the time we literally made the largest acquisition in software history. We acquired a company at the time for like $4.5 billion. I mean, we did some crazy stuff. But by summer of 2000, I felt like a fish out of water. While I had hired this person to come in, it was pretty clear that he and I were not on the same page. And I recognized I'd given up the steering wheel. I was sitting in the back seat. I couldn't be a backseat driver. That wasn't going to be healthy. And we'd also been trying hard to start a family for a number of years and had not been successful doing it. And I was beginning to realize that I was part of the problem, that just my work life and so forth wasn't compatible there. So I left. I retired in 2000. And the business remained independent. It actually survived through the bust and the nuclear winter and so forth. And then it went on. It had kind of a funny history. It was privatized by KKR at one point and then taken back out and so forth. But the chapter for me ended in the summer of 2000. And then I spent a number of years serving on some boards and doing some activity like that while I was starting to raise the family. And then by about 2006, 2007, I really had the itch again. Michael and I both, and wanted to work together again.
And I imagine that was around the time when social media was really starting to take off, and you had the MySpaces and Facebook had just kind of come into the picture. And so was that part of the reason you felt like timing was better now to restart this idea?
So it's funny that there are a couple of things happened. When we got together, we actually got together in Vail, Colorado in August of 2006. And we sat down for 3 days together and said, what do we want to go do? What kind of business we want to start? And we actually spent a bunch of time, even without saying what idea are we going to follow. We actually spent a lot of time looking at, if we had been founders of other companies, what would they have been? What companies do we admire out there? And the really telling thing was, the more we built that list, the more we realized, well, it's definitely not enterprise software again. We're not doing that again. And when we started to make the list, we realized there was a common thread, which was they were consumer based and they were kind of iconic brands. They were it was the Patagonias and the Virgins and the Oakleys of the world that had kind of touched a nerve, maybe with a very specific audience, but they'd kind of lasted time and had just built this trust with their consumer. And so that was the first driver, which was, okay, let's do that. That sounds interesting. So where would we do that and what space? And we actually looked at a number of different spaces, everything from water conservation to Strava. But you're right. When it came to Strava, there were two things that had changed in the really 15 years since we'd first tried it. Number one was social media, like you just alluded to, and the other was connected devices, wearable things like Garmin devices and so forth. That we now had the ability to access activity data in a much more seamless way. 1995, we were basically asking somebody to go finish a run and then type down, hey, how far did you go and how fast? That's a lot of friction. By 2007, 2008, you could use, whether it was a watch or even your smartphone to capture that information. And so that made it much easier to then build an experience that people could enjoy.
Yeah. How about personally? Like you had started this successful company, taking it public, you're serving on all these boards. What gave you the, desire to want to become an entrepreneur again? And again, like checking the ego at the door, like you're going back to, hitting the ground running. And I can imagine that is definitely like, a hit to the ego as well a little bit, but like, why did you want to do that again?
Yeah. So I'll mention a couple of things. One is I'll be the first to warn anybody who thinks that boards are the way to go. I always joke that sitting on boards is like eating junk food. It tastes really good in the moment. You feel like, here I'm contributing and then you leave that boardroom and it's like, I'm adding no value whatsoever here. Like the operators are the ones who really, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are accountable and have it. And so I figured
that's why it's called a board.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's just spelled incorrectly.
Yeah.
And there's a place for it. I do appreciate even today the time that I spend on boards, but it's a satellite activity. It can't be my core activity. So that was one driver. The other driver goes back to sort of what happened in Vail. Once Michael and I got really intrigued by this idea of building a trusted kind of consumer brand, the thing we liked about it was that we'd never done it before. Like we were back to being kids again and out there taking risk, and kind of the playbook that we could deploy was the same one I talked about earlier. We don't know how to do this. Let's go find people who have. Let's go talk to the experts. Let's go. So when you talk about checking your ego, it's pretty easy because we don't know how to build a consumer brand. What's involved in that? And that was really fun, just the intellectual challenge of it. And then the third piece was, I mentioned earlier, but it's important to know because as entrepreneurs, like this was solving a problem that he and I had.
Right.
Like, people think I'm joking when I say, like, if we'd been the only two customers, but there is some truth to that. Like, we wanted to solve this because we needed something that would keep us motivated to be active. And so we were trying to craft an opportunity that in its worst case scenario would solve that problem.
Mark, if my USC math is correct, you were about 38 at the time when you started this thing. So did you?
Right? I actually just calculated that as well, and I got 38.
Yeah, I didn't use one of those, Pat. I'm sorry. You should have gone to Harvard. But what was that like? I assume maybe you had a family. I don't want to make an assumption, but I assume you had a family at the time. And, did you seek further financial success, or was it just because you were truly bored and you wanted something to do? There was this unfulfilled, dream. It was a better timing, right? Like, what was it? Describe that situation and describe like what conversations you had in your head and perhaps with like your wife and others of like what's going to happen.
Yeah. So let me lay the context and then tell you sort of what was in my head. So in that time frame, now we're talking 2006, 2008, 2009 was the official start date, but kind of through that period. So number one, I actually got divorced. So 2005, Lisa and I divorced. She's still one of my closest, dearest friends, but we're just much better as two friends raising two incredible boys. We've got these twins, Jake and Charlie. So it was raising them. And so now they're 5, 6, 7 years old. So they're beginning to go off to school. So there's some freedom that I have in terms of just time and bandwidth. And we were co-parenting and splitting time there. As I mentioned, I was thirsty for something beyond just serving on boards. And I think, your question about the financial one is interesting. My thesis, and I learned this going all the way back at TA Associates, that there were two things. One is I am a big believer that if you want to be successful financially, own something that you have the ability to influence its value. I appreciate people who make incredible salaries every year, and it's not to take away from that strategy, but for me personally, I am particularly intrigued by this idea of I'm going to go create something, and then what can I do to increase its value? So this idea of ownership and value, but the second thing I say is the minute that you start focusing on the financial outcome is pretty much the same minute that you're going to start to diminish the value. Like
Right.
there has to be a higher order purpose to what you're doing. And if you do that, I believe the financials will follow. At least they have for me twice in a row. It's only a data set of 2, but when we just said, look, we're not sure what the business model is going to be here, but we are going to, there is a fundamental model that we're going to follow, and we're going to think through this. So we were thinking like businessmen, but we were also maniacally focused on a customer experience. We wanted to build this great product that they would love, and so much so that they'd want to pay us for it. That was the other key thing. We knew who our customer was. Then you know what? I'm going after the financial prize like everybody else. But secondary to, are we building something that people are excited about?
One thing I'm curious about, originally when you had the idea, in the mid 90s, I think you mentioned in your late 20s. Is that right? You're like
mid to late 20s. Exactly. I think it was like 26.
And so you ended up starting another company, but then you came back to this, and now you're like in your late 30s, and you're starting, and obviously you had some success and whatnot. But I think there's a lot of pressure that people put, especially people who are from a young age want to be entrepreneurs or have this desire to do entrepreneurship, that they think, if I don't start something in my early to late to mid to late 20s, then it's going to be too late. I'm going to have a family, I'm going to have kids, and I'm just never going to do it, right? But clearly that's not true, right? You could start something in your late 30s and early 40s, and there's just different factors at that point, right? Like you're much more experienced, much more knowledgeable, maybe you have a better network, like the likelihood of success could be higher at that point. So I mean, is there anything you can add to that? Because I think it's something that I see often. I've personally like felt that before, that pressure of like, I got to start something now if I don't do it now, So just, thought I'd ask.
No, I love the question, because I think you're spot on. I think it's that you can absolutely be an entrepreneur at any point along sort of your, the age continuum. You just have to acknowledge that the circumstances will be different. You have to, you're solving for potentially different problems. So you're right. When I was back 25, 26, really, it was just, there was so little risk. But the problem was I had no resources behind me. I had no network really to follow. So I was starting from scratch. You fast forward to 38, you're right, 38, 39. Well, now I did have network. I did have research. I did have people I could reach out to, whether it was to capitalize the business, whether it was to find additional experts. So a lot of doors had been created because of my past success. The challenges I now faced were how to balance being the parent that I wanted to be and being available to those kids. Time management became a much bigger issue. Michael and I tell this story. He and I have both been CEO of Strava twice in its 13-year history. I started as CEO. I had to step away because of basically family health issues. Michael was kind enough to step in and he ran it. He ran it for 4 years. Then he had to step away due to a family health issue. And so I stepped back in because at that point, my life was stable enough. So very different in terms of circumstance and so forth, but just as fun. I think it's what kept us young. It's, that's the beauty of this. And I would encourage anybody who has that. The ones that bother me the most are the entrepreneurs who are like, well, I really want to do it, but I don't have the right idea. It's like, I've never ended up building the idea that I started with. Like, let's just put that fallacy aside. Like it's you got to have something so you can have conversations with people, but then you navigate to what is an interesting business. And
clearly, again, this was obviously something that you were really, really passionate about for it to come back and like want to do it again. And so tell us, like, when you first were trying to get it off the ground, I mean, what happened? Like, did you have to go out and raise money? Like, was it difficult, pitching this and getting, convincing people that this is a good idea, or were people saying, no, this is a great idea, Mark, like we're totally in? Like, what was the feedback you were getting?
Yeah. So in the very earliest days, one of the advantages that we did have, given our prior success, was that Michael and I could self-fund for a while. And we did. For really the first year and a half, we were the investors. We were loaning the business capital, and then we converted that in our first actual Series A round. So you're right. There's a perfect example of something that was very different. If you go back to the Kana days, like I'll never forget the first Series A we did at Kana was, we sold 40% of the company for $700,000. I mean, that was what we could do. That was the best we could negotiate. Very different in 2008, 2009. So we self-funded, and we had, this is another thing that I talked to entrepreneurs all about. We had a vision, which was very much around, big audacious goal, which is we want to support this global community of athletes across a broad spectrum of sports, bringing them together in one global community and have them feel like they're part of this team. That was the vision. Our go-to-market was we picked one sliver, and that was one very specific group. It was the road cyclist, a passionate roadie. Actually, we referred to them as MAMIL, MAMIL, middle-aged men in Lycra. That was our target audience. It was called, the strategy was go an inch wide and a mile deep. So we built very specific features and services for that group and started marketing to them and kind of using network to sort of find them. It was me, middle-aged man in Lycra, who liked to mountain bike ride. And we went after that group. And that, by doing that, the good news was we did build traction, we built momentum, we had strong network effect, so that when we decided to then go outside for capital, it wasn't just our backgrounds that people were betting on, but there was also there was meat to the story. They could start to see that we had good success in terms of conversion to subscription, good success in terms of sort of viral network effect and growth of the community. So while the numbers were still small, that was when we were able to raise the capital.
Yep, exactly. That's definitely ideal, I guess, when you're going into like a pitch to like a VC, is when you have those numbers and the experience. You have a little bit more leverage than if you're just getting started and just absolutely need the capital to hit the ground running. And so that's great. So I guess, in terms of, throughout the last 14, 15 years, however long it's been, so much has changed from technology standpoint, right? We talk about the how social media has evolved, connected devices have evolved. Where is all of this kind of going, do you think? Like, we hear all these buzzwords now, I don't want to say it, but you know what I mean? The metaverses and this and that. Where are things going in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I'll be the first to acknowledge that one of the challenges of being an entrepreneur is that you are so heads down in your little business that oftentimes it's very hard to understand what's going on through the forest. So take anything that I say here with a huge grain of salt. We are really excited about the space. I think that, things like the pandemic itself, I think, has taught the world that, boy, being healthy and living an active life has a lot of benefit. And we've benefited from that. We've watched our community grow dramatically over these last couple of years and seen that, it's not about chasing world records. It's not about being, some hardcore athlete. If you look at the largest growth in Strava, it's people who are walking and hiking and just realizing that getting out for 30 minutes and walking your dog, 3 days a week, tremendous benefit to that. So for us, we're excited. We're seeing a global population continue to embrace this idea of how can activity be just part of my daily, weekly life. I think we're also seeing the innovation take place, whether it's indoors. I know Peloton's, faced some hard headlines lately, but look, they've done something pretty magical around just sort of showing people that, regardless of where you are, you can work out. And so whether it's indoors like that, whether it's the outdoor activities that we see people have just done for centuries and so forth, Strava sort of finds itself at the hub of that. We often joke that we're the connect of connected fitness. We're bringing everybody together. We work with, just quick numbers, but gives you a sense of connected fitness. I mean, we have over 60,000 API partners today that that connect either their devices or their apps into the Strava ecosystem so that you can have kind of this shared experience. And I just get really excited that we're scratching the surface. One example, in just the last 12 months, the ability for you to much more accurately track your sleep. That's just one new set of data that we didn't have just a few years ago that's gotten really good. And that's whether you're using an Apple Watch or you're using an Oura Ring or you're using a Whoop device. There's literally dozens of devices out there. Even your mattress can capture your sleep data. But by seamlessly bringing that data in to a place like Strava, we're excited because that's part of your active life. Are you recovering effectively? So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but we're just excited because the population itself is appreciating sort of an active life as a good life. People keep people active, so we think community is a huge part of that. And then when we see the innovation going on across, again, all kinds of different sort of metrics and so forth, we feel like we've got a long ways to go. We joke at Strava, we may be 13 years old, but we're just getting started.
I'll give you a personal story, Mark, that I think, at least I find interesting. Maybe you will too. But my first introduction to Strava was back in, I want to say, late 2014, early 2015. And the reason why, so Pat and I are both, we come from an Armenian background. And it was the centennial anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And so a group of these cyclists, Armenian, older, let's call it, when I say older, they were like 45 to 55 years old. And I was like, I'm 29 now. So I don't know, 7 years ago, 22, 23 years old. And they wanted to organize to essentially gain recognition and get awareness, a cycling trip from Los Angeles, where we're at, to Washington, D.C. to deliver like basically, I don't know if it was a bill or like a recognition bill or whatever the Congress calls it, to Congress. And so I was a part of that planning committee and board, right? Back to the word board. And that one was more interesting and fun. But Strava was really the basis of tracking the different kind of routes that they took throughout the United States. I think there was like, I don't know, there's got to be at least 25 plus legs that they did. I think they did 2 a day for like 13 days. And that was how, and they integrated with our website, how our audience essentially tracked where those cyclists were and where individually they were and where they were as a team. And I just thought that was, at the time, this is 2015. So, 2022, you're like, oh, wow, what, that's just like a part of life. But it was incredible to just kind of track the journey that these cyclists kind of had, and just thinking about the fact that because of an app like Strava, you're able to kind of do something like this. Sure, there's always a physical component, but the fact that you could bring a community both that is physically active in cycling, but also active in engaging with those that are active, I thought was pretty incredible. So, whether it's in real life or the metaverse, I think
you made my day, and it is such a good example of what Strava can do, because it's for those cyclists, it was simply a way for them to engage. But then there's this greater audience, and they're delivering a message beyond just sort of how many miles they rode. And we see it time and again. It's a really fun aspect of Strava that I never thought would happen.
Yeah, if anything, I would think it's just gonna, like you said, you're just getting started. It's going to get even more and more important, because, I mean, it is kind of scary, like looking at, where technology is going, and, we're just everything's becoming more and more digital and digital and digital. And so there's this whole like physical aspect. But the nice thing is it's a, Strava's connected to like this physical thing that you do. You go out there, you run, you cycle, but there's this whole digital aspect that kind of brings it online, which is, I think, super, super cool.
Pat, it's funny you say I'll share 2 things that are so important inside Strava. One is there's a metric that we actually track, and right now it's a ratio. It's 50-1. So for every 1 minute you're in the app, we're finding that our athletes on average spend 50 minutes working out, and we're watching that ratio actually increase. So we're actually seeing them spend more time out being active in the app.
Wow.
And that to us is incredibly important, because the other thing is, remember, our business is really simple. It's a subscription. It's a freemium business. You can use Strava for free as much as you like, but if you want to upgrade to some of the features, then there's a subscription opportunity. The reason that's important is that we don't need your eyeballs. We don't need you in the app X number of minutes per day. As long as you're active and you feel like Strava is contributing to that success and you're part of that community and you stay there, then the rest is magic. The rest happens. They have a great experience, and Strava continues to grow as a business. And you're exactly right. I love those days when I put my phone in my back pocket. Strava's in the background. But when I finish, it's kind of fun to relive it. It's fun for me to think about what I'm going to title my ride or my run or my my skiing or my walk, whatever it is, and share that with some friends. And usually there's some trash talking, or somebody's giving me a hard time about my pace or whatever. But that's what motivates me to go out the next day and do it again.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think it's easy for people to look at, where things are going. You see like robotics and AI and all this kind of stuff, and think that it's easy to think that that's going to be like at the forefront of it all. But sometimes thinking of it as like in the background of it all, like how Strava is, it's like powering it, but you're still being the human that you are, and you're still doing human things, is something that maybe it's hard to imagine, but it's super interesting that that's the way you guys approach it.
Yeah, no, it is. It's the best days are the ones that are muddy and messy and raw, but you just get to be yourself, and that's if we're helping people celebrate that, then we see good things happen, and we do. I mean, I could spend the next hour on what happens when we get almost 2 billion activities just in the last year alone. When you have that much information coming in, the kinds of work you can then do as a community to help. We could spend a whole hour on just our Strava Metro project. We have 1,500 partners out there today using the data to rethink urban infrastructure, to rethink the way in which they're moving people and bicycles through major cities, looking at climate change issues. We have people who studied sort of basically looking at the way in which our Strava members move through parks and national parks and so forth, so that we can fight wildfires more effectively. So that's what's so much fun, is that as this group just goes out and has fun every day, and this community now of about 95 million people, like just as active, there's so many great things we end up doing together. And that's why even when you talk about your Armenian friends who does the cycling ride, it's just another example of like the power of shared purpose.
Yep.
And when you put it around kind of athletic endeavor or active activity endeavor, it's amazing what people are willing to do.
I love it. Well, I think we could sit here and chat for hours. This has been an incredible conversation, and can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing your story and wisdom and everything that you've like learned along the way. And can't wait to see what comes next, for you, but also for the company and where things are headed. It's really exciting, and hopefully, we can meet in person someday soon. But this has been awesome. Thank you,
guys. It's really my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.